Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Geopolitical Futures podcast. After a pretty significant period of abstention, we are back with a vengeance, and the timing couldn't be better. As some of you may or may not know, right now is forecast season for us. It's when we start questioning our assumptions about the world, rethinking the ways we think about certain countries, generally preparing for the year ahead, embodied in our annual forecast, which is set to drop sometime in December. I think we're going to dedicate an entire podcast episode to that. But in the meantime, we're thinking deep thoughts about these countries, and to that end, I asked some of our analysts to share their thoughts on countries that confound them or confuse them, or countries that they can't quite figure out, they can't quite put their finger on, that sort of defy some of their assumptions and so on. If this sounds like an open-ended question, that's because it is an open-ended question, and we'll see what they have to say. Joining me to talk confusedly about these things is Jacob, our director of analysis.
Cole, I'm surprised at you for saying period of abstention when you could have just used the word hiatus. I'm used to using too many words and you cutting them down. I'm a little off center now.
Well, yeah, this is the irony of the podcast where you edit me instead of the opposite. And I think that's probably why we just kind of generally hate each other a little bit. Joining us is Allison Fedorka, our senior analyst.
Hi, glad we're doing these podcasts again.
And Phil. How's it going, Phil?
I love both you guys.
Oh, shucks.
Well, I mean, wait, hold on, there's three of us. Crap.
It's okay. I know where I stand.
Well, the thing is, like, neither one of us said that we hated Allison, so this is fine. Who wants to go first here? I'm more than happy to. And for our listeners, we have kind of coordinated this a little bit by dropping hints so that we didn't have too much overlap in some of these countries. But we have kind of our own lists, and we're going to compare notes here. However, I do want to start with this one country because it's been it's been in the news lately, and it still is. Well, that country is Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia isn't exactly confusing, right? It's not too hard to figure out. This is a country where sorcery and homosexuality can still be punishable by death. It's a one trick pony. It's a petrostate, right? They have almost like a singularly focused economy. It's all on hydrocarbons. There's no economic diversity. They export hydrocarbons. They import just about everything else. I think one statistic I read was 50% of everything they consume is imported, right? Nearly 70% of their population is younger than 30. They made a social contract at some point where as long as they made a lot of money and they subsidized the lifestyles of their citizens, particularly the bureaucrats, the government could basically do what it wanted and they wouldn't get in the way. Now they're trying to do some economic reform, spearheaded, of course, by Mohammed bin Salman, but he's a controversial figure, to say the least, made apparent by the conflicts in Yemen, some questionable arms deals, and obviously most notably the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. How do you see it going on like this? What are its long-term prospects? How viable is this country going forward? Countries don't just engage in really ambitious economic reform just because they want to. They do it because they have to, right? Jacob, I know you've thought a lot about Saudi Arabia. Do you want to correct me or tell me how stupid I am off the bat, or do you want to ease into it?
Well, I was trying to catch you in a mistake because I could have sworn that there were laws against witchcraft in other countries, but it looks like the UK repealed their laws against witchcraft in the 1700s. So I can't say that.
That's too bad.
But look, Saudi Arabia is that vast gas station in the desert. And it's confusing because, there's really not a lot you can compare it to. It's no longer just tribal. It's no longer just religious. It's sort of a marriage of tribes and religion. And then they found a bunch of oil and they're using the oil to cement their ties. And they are surrounded by either other tribal countries or, actually sort of mature, well, let's not call them mature, but real nation states like Iran or like Turkey or like Israel. And the thing that is so fascinating about the Saudis is whether there is such a thing as the Saudis, whether that means something beyond just the people who happen to live within what are today the defined borders of their kingdom. And I think that's an open question.
Yeah, important to keep in mind too. The current incarnation of Saudi Arabia is only about what, like 100 years old. So this is not one of those eternal countries that's been around for a long time either. But without sounding so fatalistic about things, no one here is prepared to say that Saudi is going anywhere anytime real soon. Um, but I guess especially the past few weeks have kind of called into question what business as usual means in a place like Saudi Arabia, and how they can continue to do that in perpetuity. It's hard to think that they're going to be able to do that, and whether they can pull off these economic reforms.
It sounds like they're trying to redefine to a degree what is business as usual. So what we see them doing today and what we see them doing 10, 15, 20 years from now may not necessarily be the same thing. It may not be what the reforms have in mind either. But the idea of continuing business as usual is, I don't think it's necessarily something that they have in mind for their future. So we've seen them with these economic reforms. The fact that Saudi Arabia is even thinking about these things right now, again, as you say, reforms are always difficult to do, but there are other countries in the world where you can look at them and they don't think, 5, 6, 7 steps ahead. They think about today, they think about tomorrow, and they don't get beyond that. So in that sense, I do think it's when I think of Saudi Arabia doing business as usual, I think that business will change as time goes on because they are trying to think ahead and figure out solutions before they are confronted with a economic collapse, say like a country like Venezuela or something like that.
I think Saudi's tricky just because it's one of these countries like, so I was thinking about like what makes a country hard to understand in the first place. And, I kind of came up with like three broad types. Like one is like the sort of the black box country with a tightly controlled media that's really hard to get a sense of what's going on in the internal politics in ways that is shaping its behavior. And another type of country is one that has deep internal fractures that keep a government pretty internally focused. And Saudi is both of those in a lot of ways. We have a good sense of some things, but it's notoriously opaque. But you never really feel like we have a really solid understanding of everything that's happening at any given moment. Even it's up for debate, like exactly how big their oil reserves are, because they're pretty guarded with that data. They could have a lot more. They could be running out a lot quicker than we think, and that may explain some of the sense of urgency that they have to start planning ahead. And the third type of country is a country that's just so dependent on factors outside of its control that it can make it really unpredictable. And I think Saudi kind of fits in that bucket too. It depends on oil prices. Can't really control those to an extent. But if the regional environment, what the U.S. does, I think a lot of what we're seeing now is a result of this like deep anxiety that it has that the U.S. will, continue on with sort of the Obama era balance of power strategy, where it tries to just, kind of maintain some sort of balance between it and Iran and Turkey and stuff. And so that does give it a lot of uncertainty about the way it's behaving, and it's hard to pinpoint any particular driver at any given time.
I think the only thing I would add to that too is that intentions kind of confound analysis as well. So you run into this a lot because you study China a lot, Bill. But I think most people who look at the Saudi economy agree that economic diversification is key to survival, and to that end, Mohammed bin Salman is doing that. But also cynically, a lot of people think that he's just doing like bald-faced power consolidation and using this very necessary thing as a justification for some of those power grabs. And you see that to some degree, I think, with Xi Jinping in China and his anti-corruption drive. But again, you could just as easily argue that he does have to tame that bureaucracy to get anything done. So we're just like left wondering, what are their intentions. So once you start grabbing at people's intentions, I think that you start venturing outside the realm of analysis.
I just want to jump in and say two things. The first of which is you'll learn that I'm a multitasker. There was actually a court case, Detmer versus Landon, in which the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit recognized Wiccans as a religion. So it's actually witchcraft is a constitutionally respected religion in the United States. I thought our listeners might want to know that.
Is witchcraft the same thing as sorcery, though? I'm not a lawyer.
there's differences between faith healing and self hypnosis and tarot card reading and spell casting, but apparently, if you're a Wiccan, that is a legitimate religion in the United States since 1980. So the more you learn.
Oh wow. Well, you know what? I am all of a sudden less confused about Saudi Arabia. This is I'm kidding.
No, but the thing I actually wanted to say was that there's also a mutual unintelligibility thing here between I think people in the West and between Saudi Arabia. And I think a good example of this is the Jamal Khashoggi murder, because Saudi Arabia has come on a lot of people's radar recently because of how grisly that murder was. And I think if you're looking at it from the Saudi perspective, it doesn't make any sense for the Khashoggi murder to have actually been that big of a deal. That was an internal Saudi affair with somebody who had, previously worked in Saudi intelligence, and yeah, he was a journalist, sure, but it wasn't exactly clear who he was and what he was doing. And Saudi Arabia, since the Trump administration has come into power, but also a little bit before then, has been trying to be a better ally to the United States. They're going to war in Yemen in part because they think that's what the U.S. wants them to do. They're pushing back against Iran in part because they think that's what the U.S. wants them to do. The U.S. wants the Saudis to use all these weapons and all this money to actually push back so the U.S. doesn't have to do everything in the Middle East itself. And so Saudi Arabia is doing all of these things, and yet the murder of a single individual somehow has the entire relationship under a significant amount of pressure. And I think if you look at young Saudis who are, I don't want to call them liberal, but they're different than their parents and their grandparents, right? Because they want to go watch movies and they want to go to concerts and they want society to be more open and they want to have jobs that are not just, taking handouts and all these other things. At the same time, a lot of Saudis have reacted very negatively to the negative press that has come against the king, that has come against the crown prince, because they feel like their country is being unfairly blamed for, admittedly a murder that is awful, but people die in the world all the time. I don't mean to make light of it, but this is something that happens. So while we're sitting here thinking about how Saudi Arabia is confusing, I think that a young Saudi would look at the United States and find the United States just as confusing. And I think that's one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of frame of reference personally, or most people don't, for thinking about what Saudi Arabia is and what life is like.
Hell, we all live here, and the United States confuses me. Is that actually on any of y'all's lists?
No, but I wish it was. That would have been a good one.
I mean, I probably spend more time thinking about why the U.S. is confusing than any other country in the world. I think lots of people probably feel that way recently, just trying to make sense of the domestic political situation, but also just the U.S. in general, it has fewer external constraints on behavior than any country in the world. It can try to do things. It can start wars. It could make bad decisions, good decisions, whatever. It could spend all sorts of money and very rarely pay serious consequences for what it does. That doesn't mean the U.S. can be successful at whatever it tries, but it just means it can experiment a lot. It can change, from one, pretty divergent strategies from one administration to another, or based on shifts in domestic political circumstances and that stuff, because the U.S. survival is rarely at stake except for in very narrow circumstances. And so, the U.S. is internally very confusing, and that has major implications that make it hard to understand what it's doing abroad as well.
Well, let's move on then. I don't think we're going to solve all the United States problems today. Jacob, what do you got?
I'm cheating a little bit because I've been thinking a lot about
good. Cheating is encouraged here.
That's good, and witchcraft apparently. I've been thinking a lot about Brexit lately, and in particular the relationship between the UK and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and all of these things together. And I have found while doing research on this that the relationship between the island that is Ireland and the island that is Great Britain, it's really complicated. It's there's hundreds of years of history there, and it is kind of hard to get down to exactly what's going to happen here in the next 6 to 12 months with Brexit coming up.
What have you found that has, in your research, what surprised you the most about Ireland compared to some of the other places that you've been looking at?
Yeah, it's The thing about it is, and I guess one of the ways to think about this is, I know, Cole, that you told us to come with countries that are confusing, but I guess really what I'm talking about here is that what is complicated is this relationship between Great Britain and between Ireland, not necessarily the countries, but those geographic masses themselves. And they have had profoundly different histories. And there are profoundly different forces acting on both. And it's the sort of the focal point of that has become now Northern Ireland. It's similar to the way history has gone before, and yet it's also kind of different. Since the EU really got going in the 90s, when the Cold War had ended, it basically took the geopolitical reasons away from conflict between the United Kingdom and between Ireland. Because one of the reasons that that British monarchs and then successive British governments worried about Ireland was because it was a great place for continental enemies of Great Britain to try and get a base, or to try and get some way in order to hem Great Britain in. And once you had both Great Britain and Ireland in the same political structure, basically, a lot of that threat went away. And what Brexit is doing is that it's threatening to take away that shared basis, and suddenly things that people A, hadn't thought about in 20 years, and B, didn't think they were going to have to think about again, they're having to think about again. And then on top of that, this is one of those situations where it's really hard to understand what the demographics are telling you, because if anybody out there has been reading about Brexit, you probably see all the flashy headlines about how there are going to be more Catholics than Protestants in Northern Ireland, probably by 2021, by the time of the next census. I don't know what that means. For one thing, the church is not nearly as powerful in Ireland as it once was. And for another thing, one of the things that all the census study shows is that people in Northern Ireland, in the United Kingdom, in Ireland are less religious. A lot of them are choosing no religion instead of Catholic or Protestantism. And I think one of the things that we're seeing with Brexit is that, or the danger that people are really worried about with Brexit, is that whether Northern Ireland stays in the custom union or not, or whether that is becoming a focal point for these old arguments that are hundreds of years old, and they actually have something to argue about now. And it's in this, if you look at sort of where Catholics live in Northern Ireland, and if you look at where Protestants live in Northern Ireland, and you look at who voted for Remain and who voted for Leave, they map pretty well right onto each other. And that's when you start to worry that the substructure here is unstable. So I've been rambling, but those are the things I've been thinking about lately.
Well, that sounds like a really interesting podcast episode for another day. The obsolescence or non-obsolescence of religion in Europe, and we don't need to go down that hole right now, but that'd be super interesting.
No, but I think it goes back, and I'm pretty sure that all of the countries that we're going to bring up here, the most difficult thing to learn about, I think, international affairs or geopolitics or whatever word you want to use, it's, you can learn trade relationships, you can figure out who's trading with who and where export dependency is, and you can learn how a political system works and where power is going to be, and what a country's military is going to do relative to another country's military. The thing that is really, really hard is to figure out what people will die for, what people feel attached to, what people feel afraid of, right? So if you're thinking about Saudi Arabia and you want to try and project what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia in the next 10 or 20 years, you can look at the crown, Mohammed bin Salman's plans and say, well, this is crazy, or no, this isn't so crazy. They could probably do this. But the real question is whether society is going to be behind him, and whether the Saudis are going to be able to work together towards some kind of unified sense of what their country is going to be. It's the same thing in the Northern Ireland question that I was just talking about. Is it important enough? Are these old prejudices and biases, if you let them out for a little bit of air, is that still something that people are going to fight about? Lost in the discussion of Northern Ireland, I think, is the fact that a lot of people in the Republic of Ireland, sure, there are nationalists that want to have a unified Ireland, but a lot of them don't want it. In the same way that a lot of West Germans didn't want East Germany, and a lot of South Koreans don't want North Korea. They didn't want to pay for it. And in the same sense, there are plenty in the UK who don't think that the UK should be in Northern Ireland anymore, and don't want to pay 10 billion extra pounds in order to finance Northern Ireland and keep the peace there. So it really all comes down to, what is British identity and what is Irish identity? And is there even Northern Irish identity? Because 20 or 30% of Northern Irish people will identify as Northern Irish. And then you've got a whole other thing. So the hardest thing in some ways is understanding what those communities are.
Let's move on. Allison, we haven't heard much from you. What confuses you?
So I actually have a petrostate as well, Cole, and mine is
Nice.
Venezuela. So
Ooh.
I'm confused about how inflation can theoretically reach 10 million% or something like that. But that's what it's estimated to go next year. Sorry, go on.
no, it's true. It doesn't sound that crazy when you look at other countries in the region who've had, four-figure inflation in the past. But Venezuela, I am constantly trying to understand how you still have the Maduro government in power. It's vexing because in many ways it is a political question of who can garner what relationships to maintain the power, control it, create schemes to work together. But at the same time, a lot of the strategies you've seen other countries use to try to break the government, promote a change in government in Venezuela, they've been chipping away at the country for years and years and years, and it hasn't worked. Even now, the US has yet to be able to make any changes with all of their sanctions. The US is working with the European Union, they're working with Mexico and Colombia. You've got pretty much anybody who's ever had an interaction with Venezuela or regularly interacts with Venezuela working together to try to bring about some type of government change, and it's not happening. People are still saying that it has not yet hit rock bottom. And when you determine that point, how can you figure out that point, is very frustrating and perplexing, because it does involve black market economies trying to prop things up and a whole host of informal systems and creative systems and cryptocurrencies and you name it to somehow remain afloat. But it is by far, to me, one of the most amazing structures that is still standing, where it is band-aid on top of band-aid on top of band-aid. And I constantly find myself thinking about, well, when does this collapse? When does this end?
Would you describe it as a failed state, Allison?
Yes, there's plenty of people who've also made the case that it is a failed state at this point. They still have their government institutions there. So if it were to collapse, you might still be able to put in new people in government institutions without necessarily having to completely scrap everything. But it is no longer a functioning government in the way that it can take care of its entire population or address major concerns of the country in an effective way.
Philip, do you think that designation's an important one?
No, I was just thinking just how difficult it is to when a state collapses like that and it basically stops functioning in ways that it typically has. It's how difficult it is to determine what Allison was saying, which is what rock bottom looks like, or what what kind of what a breaking point would mean that would lead to some kind of change in trajectory. I mean, there's plenty of other examples that you look around the world of countries that just really aren't delivering basic services or developing any kind of sustainable path forward toward growth or toward like improvements in livelihoods, and do kind of tend to stay that way for a long time, absent. Well, I don't really know. I don't know how a state like that climbs out.
I think the most telling thing, that Allison touched on too, goes back to what Jacob was saying earlier about what people are willing to fight for. This used to have a pretty robust opposition, and it's something that we always looked at. Who are their leaders? How many of them are incarcerated or whatever? And now people are just leaving. They're just leaving in droves, right? And she wrote a really good piece on that some weeks ago. And for I don't want to say the first time, but the Venezuelan crisis is starting to have some regional implications, as you see these giant droves of people going to places like Peru and Ecuador, especially Brazil. They just elected a very nationalist leader, and I don't know what exactly he has up his sleeve in that regard. But it's interesting. Like, this is all interesting right now. Venezuela used to be kind of a self-contained, boiling pot, and now it's spilling over, and that's really interesting.
Allison, how many refugees are there right now in sort of the last, I don't know, let's pick an arbitrary number, 3 or 4 years from Venezuela?
So the UN's Immigration Office released a report earlier this week and puts the estimate at 3 million people now, which is In March, when they released the same report, it was 2.3 million, with most of them leaving in the past 2 years. So if you think of 700,000 people leaving a country over the course of 6 to 9 months, it's a lot compared to not seeing much of anything, 4 or 5 years prior.
I think one of the interesting comparisons there to do would be, I think there are something like 6.5 or 7 million refugees from the Syrian civil war. Why do you think that Syria devolved into a violent civil war, whereas Venezuela has just sort of lugubriously degraded into a political opposition?
So in the past, this is not the first time that Venezuela is having some type of domestic unrest where you see a section of the population rising up against the government. What is different this time around slightly than before is one of the more common, like the Venezuelan style of toppling a government that they don't like, tends to involve some type of civil military cooperation, or what they call a civil military coup, where you have both groups working together to depose the current government. This time around, the opposition has not been able to work with the military. The government has really brought in the military to the point where they both are mutually dependent on each other. And in terms of the lower ranking officials, I think they've really done a concerted effort to crack down and prevent any of the more junior people from moving into the opposition and things like that. So that definitely took some wind out of their sails and took them off of their normal Venezuelan roadmap of how do we depose a leader that we don't like.
While we're in the region, Allison, I'm gonna put a couple questions to you. Now I know I'm kind of tipping my hat a little bit here by talking to you and talking about the region, but let's just pretend I didn't say that. Um, here's a little quiz for you. Here's a nation that we would call a developed nation. This is a place that's completely buffered, by an ocean on one side, by mountains from another. It's got mostly friendly relations with its immediate neighbors. It's got a healthy population with relatively promising demographics, like 44 billion people. I think birth rates are good. People have high life expectancy. More than 1 million square miles big, right? Tons of fertile land. It has lots of minerals. It's got ample energy resources, and it's got potential for renewable energy. It's got a serviceable port, pretty high GDP as far as things go. I think it's around 630 billion or 640 billion or so. Would you know what I'm talking about if I threw out all those statistics at you in a shotgun approach like I just did?
Are you talking about Colombia?
I'm talking about Argentina.
Argentina.
So Argentina freaks me out a little bit because all of those things are true. It has so much promise, and yet we would not call Argentina a world power by any means. What's up with Argentina?
Well, Argentina is gone through its entire history going through these boom and bust cycles, and they will be the first ones to tell you that they have all of these promising conditions for economic development and things like that. Part of the problem is that you still have divides in economic activity. So you still have like the farm sector, the farmers are extremely important for exports, more recently for US dollars and things like that. And their needs are very different from other sectors of the population. And managing those needs has constantly kind of butt heads with other groups in society. So you have your farmers, you have your workers, and then you have your privileged business classes. And there's a lot of issues related to different economic priorities, different types of lifestyles that they've had a really hard time figuring out. How do you do this? How do we exploit our natural resources without exploiting a social class that, if they get pissed off at what the government's doing, can shut down the entire country?
Cole, I think the answer to that question has a lot more to do with where Argentina comes from. It was a colony of Spain, and the Spanish colonies, in that sense, reflected their colonial master, which was on the way down. And either the British colonies, or to a much lesser extent after the British beat them, the French colonies, reflective of more dynamic colonial powers. So I think a lot of the reason here has to do with the way that countries in South America in general, or the way that Spanish colonies in general were settled, and the interaction between the Spanish Empire and their forces and the locals. And it just goes to show you that structural difficulty or political regime actually matters a lot. On paper, Argentina should be a major global power.
I know, it's just crazy to me. I mean, you go from a net oil exporter to a net oil importer, and I forgot how long it was, but it was not very long. It's endlessly fascinating and very confusing to me.
Where we used to always talk about how Argentina, as a way to sort of illustrate the importance of rivers to a national strength, is that like Argentina, and I'm going to butcher all these facts, but whatever, in like 1836 or something, was like basically just as like developed and wealthy as the United States, in part because it had this fantastic river system that like gave it all this natural interior transportation system and fertile farmland and all that stuff. But then the two countries are obviously very much diverged from there.
Phil, you were good enough at the top of the episode to sort of provide the kind of a framework for thinking about how you think about some of these countries, but you haven't actually submitted one of your own yet. So I don't want to let you off the hook. What do you got?
Well, I don't want to be modest, but I understand everywhere.
Yeah, me too.
No, so I'm going to go with India, and to be frank, or just to be honest, a country that I find studying to be pretty intimidating. And to explain why, it's useful to sort of compare it to China, for example. Two massive countries with more than 1 billion people each. These two countries that are very similar in a lot of ways, but also very different. So when I look at China, it's China is obviously like immensely complicated. It's certainly like intimidating in its own right, but it's not that hard to put yourselves in Chinese leaders' shoes and sort of feel the pressures that they're under, as Jacob was talking about, and to sort of feel the sense of alarm and urgency that is motivating all these things these things that they're doing, and to take a look at the map and see, okay, this strategic thing is could be a crisis. This strategic thing, like they have no choice but to do this, and as you watch, that's what they're doing. But with India, it's a little bit more. It's harder to get a sense of what's going on, because it's sort of always been this, since independence, and even before in a lot of ways, it's always been sort of managed chaos and really intense internal pressures that are keeping the government very internally focused. And at the same time, the strategic threats it faces are kind of vague. It's hard to get a sense of how much they're actually worried about a country like Pakistan. Yeah, they fight, here and there, occasionally they go to war. But Pakistan doesn't pose a like existential threat to India in any situation short of nuclear war. So basically, India, kind of just tries to manage it and keep things from escalating, getting out of hand. China is starting to surround it with all these ports it's building that could conceivably, potentially, maybe one day turn into naval ports. It's not like that there's, the two countries are really on a path toward like a major naval confrontation or anything like that. China's also weighing on it from the north, but the Himalayas are huge. And as we've always talked about, like it's, a major, gloves down, a major war between the two is really improbable.
It's an interesting point about India's foreign policy, because I think you're right. It does give them a lot of wiggle room. And that goes back to the Cold War too, when India was a staunch non-aligned movement country, except when it wasn't a staunch non-aligned country, and it's still, it still buys a lot of weapons from Russia, and it still cozies up to the United States, and it's still kind of sort of participating in the Quad, but not really participating in the Quad, which is contra China. So you're absolutely right. I think that's like endlessly fascinating, but it also probably, as you say, sort of speaks to a not disarray at home, but sort of a disorganization, I think. Jacob, do you think much about India?
Sure, I think about India all the time. India's fun.
All the time.
Yeah, all the time. It's a fun place to think about. It's not a country. I'm sure I welcome all the Indians who are going to write in and say that I'm hating on India, but it's not a country.
No,
It never has been. I mean, we're talking about we're really talking about the subcontinent. I mean, the British were able to quote unquote conquer India with what, like a couple hundred soldiers with guns. You don't need a whole heck of a lot of power here. You just divide all the different communities against each other, and that's how you have to rule. And the thing that's interesting about India is whether India might exist one day.
I mean, I kind of disagree, though. I mean, I get that it's more of a federation than a tight knit nation, but by all for most intents and purposes, it's acting as a functional state and behaving, developing a military that a functional state would have. It controls most of its territory. There are parts of it that are loosely under our central control, but that's always been the India system. Has been sort of a loose shifting alliances and loosely managed coalition. But except on the stuff that matters for geopolitics, in a lot of ways, it is a functional and very large and state that is growing in power and behaving as such.
That's to say nothing of sort of the trans-border ideologies that kind of pervade India as well. And I'm speaking kind of specifically about Hindu nationalism, which is also very, very interesting that we probably don't have time to get into right now. But can that serve as a unifying or polarizing force in these like very starkly different geographic areas? Just like something to think about.
I do think this is an interesting question, though, that you're posing, Jacob, is how much does internal solidarity matter, and especially from a geopolitical perspective, in that, especially in South and Southeast Asia, that there's a ton of these countries that are very geographically either contained or isolated from from its its various internal parts or from like the rest of the world, and that can create deep internal divides that do sort of stretch the notion of a nation state. But that said, they can still behave as such.
I mean, if we're going to compare India to other countries in the world, the two ones that I think are most apt are either going to be Russia or the United States, which are both federations or federal governments, or however you want to say it, and that unite disparate peoples with different languages and different religions into a single political structure, right? And the United States has one way of doing this. Russia has one way of doing this. Comparatively, I think India is fairly disorganized, and there really is no unifying principle. Now, as a modern national project, it's also much younger. I mean, the United States is, we're talking about 1776, and Russia maybe goes a little 100 or 200 years before that if you want to get to the rise of the Russian Empire. But I would say that, both Russia and the United States, in very, very different ways, have far more coherent national identities than India does. India is important on the global stage and has been for a long time because there are so many resources there and because there are so many people there. But India, to me, remains a passive actor. Nothing that India is going to affect anything, because India is the type of country that countries do things to India. India doesn't do things to other countries. It's not going to decide. Even if India decides, okay, we're going to resist China, I don't even know what that looks like. India can't do that. It's all over the place.
Yeah, but it can play a role. It can resist China in cooperation with Australia and Japan and the United States, as we've talked about, just by leveraging its strategic positions on the Strait of Malacca. It's just rolled out its nuclear submarine, and it has nuclear weapons, and it has long-range missiles and a growing air force. And I don't know. I get what you're saying, and I agree that it is. These things. It gets to the core question of what I'm saying, or what makes India confusing is how much do these internal things prevent it from becoming a country that is capable of doing things to other countries. But I don't think the answer is necessarily that it can't, or that trajectory is that it's not on a trajectory to be becoming capable of doing so.
It seems to me the trajectory of India is to continue falling apart.
Has that been the trajectory? Because I feel like it's sort of emerging into it. It's a adolescent state in a way that is going through state puberty, which is a thing. Right after independence, it had partition and everything, but since then, it's been figuring it out and developing into more of a functional place.
I mean, it starts with partition, and then you got Bangladesh there on the side, and you've got a society. I mean, there are more Muslims in India than there are just about anywhere else in the world. You've got a nationalist president right now for who that's anathema. You've got large ethnic groups that speak their own languages with their own national identities that may want states of themselves. It's going to be very hard for India to do anything that is going to work for everyone, and I don't see what holds it together.
what is the difference then with China then, which also has many different languages, many different ethnicities, parts of the region that have historically resisted central control, and so forth.
First of all, China, yes, it does have a lot of different ethnicities and languages, but not nearly on the same level that India does. The Han Chinese are far more dominant
Yeah, that's true.
than the minority groups as compared to India.
That's true.
But then the
The
second
Han,
thing
they
there,
are, you know, within the Han core, there are different languages. I mean, Mandarin and Cantonese and others are basically mutually unintelligible.
yes, although I would compare that to sort of the situation in France in the 16 and 1700s, where there were different French dialects, and it was fairly clear that there was going to be kind of a unified France at a certain point, and that the other languages were going to be reduced in importance or slowly assimilated, and there was going to emerge a French identity and a French nation. Like China is on that path, and it seems like Mandarin is going to be the language of China. It's going to be the language of the majority of Chinese, and that's not going to be controversial. I think the other thing to say about China is that those places that are different than sort of Han Chinese core, or that don't fit easily into that narrative or can't easily be assimilated. Um, I know that China has ways of sort of working them in ideologically, but Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, these are buffer zones. I mean, these are plain and simple areas that China controls in order to protect its core ethnic group. India doesn't have that. It doesn't look at different parts of India and say, okay, well, here is the sort of Indian core, and this area is something that we try to work in with this kind of overall communist or whatever ideology, but we know that on a geopolitical basis, this is here so that Mongolian hordes or Russia can't come in and just do whatever they want to us. Right? For India, it's really each section has to deal with what's going on around it in its own way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. That is a good distinction between the two. Although I would say that, and that is probably why a centralization would not work in India, which is why they have developed this system where they kind of let everyone go their own direction a little bit while trying to manage a few things here and there. That said, there is a pretty strong overriding sense of Indian nationalism that does kind of bind it together, and there's not like major outright separatist movements anymore, outside of Assam and a couple other places. And it's not, I don't get the sense that it's at risk of falling apart. It's just at risk of always being a little bit inefficient, or a lot inefficient and a lot messy and a lot. At the same time, those divides can breed resiliency. Kind of getting back to my comparison earlier, it doesn't need to have this grand unifying principle because it can just kind of move on. That doesn't mean it affect its ability necessarily to execute a coherent foreign policy strategy or start throwing its weight around it, as we're seeing.
I'd also just point out that, I mean, India is by far the poorest country that we've talked about here, which also hinders its ability to sort of do anything, because it's beyond the capacity of a central government to provide for that many people.
Yeah, but also it doesn't compared to the Chinese Communist Party has staked its legitimacy and its hold on power on its ability to deliver on its promise to make China a great power, a wealthy country, and to uplift the standards of living massively for a billion people. That's not necessarily what is expected of the Indian government. Obviously, yes, it needs to deliver, otherwise it'll lose the next election, but it'll just lose the election. The whole system's not going to come apart in the way it would China. And that gives the government a little bit of freedom to take risks and to divert spending to building military bases in Indonesia and developing a blue water navy and all these things that we're seeing it doing. I mean, I guess my underlying point is just like, for better or for worse, India is acting outward. It is developing footholds in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. It is developing bases, or trying to at least develop bases, in Southeast Asia and off the coast of Southeast Africa, and starting to throw some weight around. It does have an ability to shape its region, maybe not to the extent that other countries do, but I do think it can be a player despite what those internal weaknesses.
Yeah, by the way, Jacob, I really, really like how you say you can look at like contemporary China and say, "Oh, geez, that reminds me of linguistic trends in 18th century France." just a totally normal comparison for normal people to normally think about in their normal lives. What a freak show we are here sometimes. We need to move on a little bit, I think. But I do want to go around the horn one more time to see if there's anybody else on your list that we might have left off. Jacob, you've only submitted Ireland. You got anything else?
I think Japan is strange.
Japan is strange.
What about it?
It's
I agree, by the way.
Yeah, well, I would say first of all that unlike China, there's so much global focus on China right now that if you want to learn something about China, you can learn about it. There are people around there who are translating things or talking to companies, or even if the statistics coming out of China aren't true. I mean, there's as many statistics as you could possibly want, so you can make any argument that you want. That's not true of Japan. I find it very, very hard to get access to real information about Japan, in part because people aren't interested in it, in part because it's not the center of gravity that China has become, especially in the global economy. But there's that. And then the second thing I would just say is that, and this might not have anything to do with Japan in particular, it might just have to do with different ways that the West and the East sort of approach thinking about geopolitics. But I think Japanese foreign policy has always been more comfortable with ambiguity than, let's say, the United States or the United Kingdom. So Japan has no problem cozying up to China in an economic way while sending its helicopter carrier through the South China Sea while building an anti-China alliance, and all the while saying that ties between Japan and China have never been better. This doesn't reflect that this all makes sense to Japan in a way that, to me, it doesn't exactly make sense, because I would see things a little more black and white.
And I think also that such a historical imperial power has been relatively dormant recently is always kind of interesting. We're always waiting for that upswing, right? Like Japan is not irrelevant at all, but it does technically, I'm using air quotes, not have a military, and it still is a resource poor, but it's still not nearly as obsolete as some of these other countries that we've talked about too. It's just really interesting to me.
Yeah, I do think I think Japan is at once pretty easy to understand, but and then at once I agree entirely, Jacob. Just in the sense that, like, we know its needs, we know its its imperatives are pretty easy to define. It has no resources, therefore it has to keep sea lanes open so its whole economy doesn't grind to a halt and everything goes to chaos. I think it needs to keep overwhelming interest in keeping things at least somewhat cordial with China. It has a massive economic interest, commercial interest, and so forth in keeping trade and business flowing between the two countries. And also, it just really doesn't, it's not in any mood to go to war anytime soon. It wants to give China every chance possible, basically, to rise peacefully in the existing order and so forth. At the same time, it quite obviously needs to start developing a little bit of a containment structure, and that's why what we've been seeing it doing over the past 2 years, forging ties with India, with Vietnam, with Philippines, with Singapore, with Indonesia and Australia, those in particular, as a way to start laying the groundwork just in case things get messy, and just in case the U.S. gets distracted and bugs out of the region. All that stuff makes sense, but the stuff that's tricky to me is its internal political stuff, again, which is always the most complicated part of any country, is how that is shaping it. It's unlike any country in the world, and what it's done since World War II. Its pacifism is a little bit overstated, or a lot overstated in some ways, but it has shrunk back and sort of kept to itself and just focused on economics. Now, obviously, it couldn't do that. It didn't really have a fully, that wasn't fully of its choice to do. The U.S. sort of made it happen, and the U.S. also allowed it to happen by basically taking on most of its security imperatives. But that's not just the result of the U.S. It is a result of peculiar internal political, cultural, social things, and those same peculiar internal, social, political things have very much shaped its economic resiliency as well. The fact that it's been able to go through basically a decade and a half of completely lost growth. Without devolving into social chaos or any kind of anything hinting at revolution or anything. It is exceptional in a lot of ways, and those will have considerable influence on how the country develops from here, even if its strategic needs are fairly clear. Go ahead.
it also has exceptionally discouraging demographics right now. It's aging, it's shrinking. They're embracing wholeheartedly some technological advances that might offset some of their declining population. Um, but this is not a place that has a lot of immigrant labor. It doesn't have too many immigrants. Generally, it's something that they're, I don't want to say hostile to, but
No,
it's
they're inviting immigrants in. I think that's one of the most interesting things. Will they be able to integrate the immigrants that they want to bring in? Yeah, what the 40,000 is what they're going to bring in next year, right, Phil? Is that the number?
but we wrote about this today. There's already opposition to that though. So like, to what extent are their hands tied? To what extent can they keep this, as Phil calls it, its economic exceptionalism and resiliency going in the face of that? I think is going to be like really interesting to see in the next few years.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I mean. It's like it's pretty clear what they need to do. They need foreign workers. They can't get around that. And it's pretty easy to make a long term forecast that they will bring in foreign workers. Yet it's
Yeah.
really hard to predict at what pace. And it's the same thing with the constitutional reform. To amend the constitution to like formally allow it to have an army that functions like a normal army and does stuff far away from Japanese shores. They have to do it eventually. But at what pace and when and how will that affect things in the meantime is very hard to predict because of those internal things.
Is that enough on Japan? I think that's probably enough on Japan, right?
Right. The other country that I was going to bring up, I know we've gone really long, but was Indonesia, because I do think that's a really good example of what Jacob was talking about as not being a country. Like Indonesia is I would describe Indonesia as being what Jacob is describing India as, and it behaves in the way that we would expect India to behave if India was what Jacob was describing was, in the sense that it mostly just wants to be left alone. Its internal divides, geographic, linguistic, religious, everything else, are so deep. I mean, just look at spend a good hour just looking at a map of Indonesia, and it's almost funny how just how big and unlikely of a nation state it is, and it is very much an artificial state. And as a result, like it should be a center of gravity in the region with a massive population, with a strategically vital location, all these things, a growing market, a growing economy, everything. But it's really not, because it's so internally focused, and the way it's responding to the South China Sea disputes and to outreach by different foreign powers trying to build military ties. Yeah, it's doing it some, but mostly it's all in service of its internal needs, and it mostly just wants to be left alone.
It's India on water.
India on water. To what extent do you think it'll be left alone? I mean, you've got China expanding, to say nothing of India, Japan, China kind of going at it as well. Indonesia is not always one of those countries that we talk about when we talk about the United States and its kind of security alliance over there. We talk about it some. Do you see its role changing, or I guess, do you see the United States' perception of its role changing in the next year, in the next 2 years? Because a point you always make, and it's a really good point about all of Southeast Asia, is that maybe it wants to be left alone, but unfortunately, as is so often the case, that they're not the masters of their own destiny, and they can't really have it their way sometimes, right?
Yeah, and I guess that's what I don't understand about it, or at least what I don't understand about its future, or I find most problematic about trying to gauge is, for better or for worse, it can't be isolated, because it's not isolated. It's right smack dab in the middle of the most, one of the most important waterways in the world. It right in the middle of this growing strategic competition between all these outside powers. Its interests will inevitably be tied up in there. So what you see it doing now is doing small things here and there. It's forging this maritime partnership with India just in case. But at the same time, it's also going out of its way to make nice with China and to avoid, taking strong disputes or a strong stance on the South China Sea. It's trying to, stay on the fence as long as possible. But if things develop as we kind of expect them to, and competition increases, it won't have that choice, and eventually its interests, it'll start to see its interests sort of align more neatly with one direction or the other, and as its capabilities grow, it may start to be a little bit more proactive to try to shape how these things develop. And I suspect that'll be in line with sort of what Japan and Australia and India are trying to do in the region, more so than what China's trying to do. But it's hard to say.
Well, I think that's about all we have time for today. There's a lot more countries out there, and so there's a lot more ground we can cover in the coming weeks as our podcasts continue and as we continue to develop our forecast. Now, as I said, I think we're going to do like a forecast preview or a forecast overview rather once we get closer to publication time, probably someday in December. But hopefully this was a nice for some of our listeners and insight into how we think about when we think about these countries, even when we don't know exactly what to say about them. We're in the questions business just as much as we are in the answers business, I guess. So Jacob, Allison, Phil, thanks very much for taking the time today. Thank you to our listeners. Remember, you can always subscribe to Geopolitical Futures at geopoliticalfutures.com. Find us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. Lots of cool stuff on there. In the meantime, we'll see you out there.